Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Invisible Hate with me, Saadia Khan.
And Asad Bhai.
So, as usual, our goal on this podcast is to research a crime committed against a member of a minority community and then share as much of the story as we can with all of you. But you know what? We are not your average true crime podcast because towards the end, we'll discuss whether or not we believe that specific story qualifies as a hate crime. Today's story takes us to Hoboken, New Jersey, where in September of 1987, a 30-year-old British Indian man named Navroze Mody lies in a coma. He's just been beaten, kicked, and hit with a brick by a large group of teenage boys. His skull is fractured, his spine is severed, and one of his eyes is falling out of its socket. 4 days after passing through the hospital doors, he dies. Who are those teenage boys responsible for Navroze's death, and why did they do it? The answer seems clear. Only 2 months earlier, in July, a local hate group called the Dotbusters published a letter in the New Jersey Journal newspaper. An excerpt reads, and I quote, "If I am walking down the street and I see a Hindu and the setting is right, I will hit him or her. They are a weak race, physically and mentally." Unquote. Attacks on Indian residents have been high for a while now, so such a bold statement of violence seems connected to Navroze's assault and murder. But like most things, these connections are not as simple as they look. This is Invisible Hate. It's September of 1987. Navroze Mody is a 30-year-old banker originally from England, and he currently lives with his parents in Jersey City, New Jersey. His parents, Jamshed and Khurshid Mody, were both born in India, in the city now known as Mumbai, and moved to England in the late 1940s. Here they raised their 3 children, Navroze being the youngest, but once Navroze graduated from high school, his parents moved to California to be closer to their eldest daughter, who had moved there sometime before. So Navroze and his parents are all relatively new to the Jersey City area. His parents moved in with their son only 5 months earlier in April after their time in California. And Navroze himself is relatively new too. He moved to Jersey City 2 years ago in 1985 after receiving his MBA from the University of Chicago, great school, and accepting a job offer with Citibank shortly after. Now his job is actually located in New York City, but Navroze didn't really want to live in Manhattan for the same reason many people choose not to live there now. Yes, I am talking about the cost of living. Jersey City is a cheaper alternative, and for Navroze, the commute is actually pretty convenient. This is all according to a blog site called filmaholic.com, written by a journalist named Maria Giovanna, who in 2007 interviewed numerous people in Navroze's life at the time. And in this same blog article, Giovanna interviews Navroze's mother, Khurshid Mody, and father, Jamshed Mody. When they moved in with their son in April of 1987, they had some reservations about Jersey City. They had been hearing about some attacks against Indians in that area, and Navroze's eldest sister, Diana, even states that she felt scared parking her car there. Isn't that crazy? Imagine you can't even park your car without feeling fearful, right, Asad?
I mean, I feel like this was the perception of New York and greater New York at the time. I remember when we were younger, we were driving through New York City, and my dad was like, he didn't want to drive in certain parts of the city because he had perceptions of it. And it was, a crime-ridden city, during this time.
Right, so these worries are not unfounded then, right?
Go back to India. Why? We don't want you here.
You look nasty, alright? Dirty Hindu.
Racism in this country is nothing new, as we all know, but Jersey City in particular had been witnessing an uptick in anti Indian sentiment since the 70s. And we'll get into the details of why a little later, but just for now that yes, in the months leading up to Navroze's attack, many Indian residents were experiencing an increasing number of insults, threatening calls, burglaries, vandalism, and assault.
It's shocking, and as you mentioned, it's not shocking at all. I think just for some context, and I don't know a lot of the details, but the US did pass an immigration act in the late 60s, and so a lot of highly skilled workers from South Asia and beyond started to come and settle in the States, my parents being one of them. And so I can imagine this influx of people from the Indian subcontinent coming to America, and then white Americans, some of them being uncomfortable with this influx of new people. And so you can imagine that whenever there is change like that, there are going to be some people that do horrible things. And so it's no wonder that Modi's family feels really uncomfortable in this new place as violence is rising.
You're absolutely right, Asad. And get this, on September 12, just over 2 weeks before Navroz himself would be attacked, there was another violent incident in Hoboken, only a 15-minute drive from Jersey City. Now, two Indian college students were severely beaten outside of a local restaurant. They weren't even robbed, Asad, which means that theft wasn't a motive for the attack. At least that's how I see it. And that is an important detail, by the way. Maybe the incident was random, but with the area's history of targeted attacks against Indians, you can understand why it seems like more than a coincidence, right, Asad?
Yeah, I completely agree with that.
But we don't know if Navroz knew about the case specifically, and that really breaks my heart. In fact, in September, Navroz had just come back from a friend's wedding in France. He may not even been in the country on September 12th, so probably he was not aware of what was happening.
Right. Pre-internet days.
Yes, absolutely. We do know, however, that on the 27th of that month, he's back home. So now he's back in Jersey City, and by evening, he is driving to Hoboken to grab dinner and a drink with a friend and a client of his, a man named William J. Crawford. The night is quite an enjoyable one, as William would recount later in a New York Times article written in 1989. Navroze and William had been drinking, but they were not drunk.
Yeah, sadly, I feel like just like in a couple of our other previous episodes, my guess is that alcohol might have a part to play in this incident.
Absolutely, Asad, and that's how I feel. But anyway, William and Navroze finish their meals and leave the Gold Coast Cafe at around 11 p.m. Now, accounts about what happens next vary. According to William Crawford's statement in that same New York Times article from 1989, William and Navroze were walking to William's car when a group of at least, and get this, Asad, 10 teenage boys and girls start taunting Navroze.
Yeah, and so sadly, according to articles that we found, they actually aren't taunting him for his race. They're actually making fun of him for his bald head, apparently calling him things like Kojak and Baldy. And just so you are aware, because you obviously weren't here in the 70s, Kojak is a reference to a popular TV show at the time starring Telly Savalas, who was bald. And as someone who was also bald myself, I've been called Kojak, mostly by people that were alive in the 70s. But for Navroze, the issue was in terms of why he was bald. He has genetic alopecia, and basically by the time that he was 20, he had lost all the hair on his head, including eyebrows and eyelashes, and so that's why he was being teased.
Absolutely, Asad. And the teasing escalates. Some reports say one of the teenagers bumped into Navroze. Another report says that they reached for his head. Either way, it becomes physical. William Crawford is pushed against a fence and falls to the ground. The teenagers later claim that Navroze then assumed a karate stance and even shoved one of the teenage girls. Now, this seems bizarre to me, and we are going to talk about it later, but it just doesn't make sense. And if he assumed a karate stance, he was probably defending himself. So, anyways, this is why the incident would later be termed as a street fight by some police officers, not a targeted attack. But there are a few important things to keep in mind while you imagine this confrontation unfolding in your mind. Number one, Navroze is a 30-year-old man, and the teenagers are all between the ages of 14 and 16. I don't know, I just have hard time believing that this 30-year-old banker would get into a quote street fight with a bunch of kids. It doesn't make sense to me. What do you think, Asad?
It's one thing if it was one other teenage kid or one other person, but for us to think that Navroze was of the mindset that he was going to take on 10 teenage kids, a lot of whom were boys, it just it doesn't jive with what I'm thinking.
Absolutely. Number two, if anything, it seems likely that Navroze was just defending himself, as I said earlier.
Yeah.
Kids or not, this is a large group of people, as Asad mentioned, who are irrationally bothering him, and it's late at night. At first, this whole karate thing was suspicious, as I said. It seemed like a racial assumption, like, oh, this is an Asian man, so he must know karate. But in fact, according to his parents' testimony in Maria Giovanna's blog article, Navroze did in fact have a black belt in karate. So as I said earlier, if he did position himself in a so-called karate stance, maybe it was just simply self-defense.
Well, isn't that what they teach you in karate? In my
Yeah.
limited experience taking it when I was like 7, they always say, you use it only in self-defense and not for offense.
And that's exactly what he was doing. And lastly, number 3, by now Navroze has been living with his hair loss for 10 years. Giovanna's article states he was no stranger to weird looks from other people or to people teasing him about his appearance. And Giovanna's article also states that Navroze often joked about his baldness, in that self-deprecating way.
Oh, I know that very well, Saadia.
Classmates and friends describe Navroze as being fun-loving, charming, and easy to get along with. Yeah, this doesn't sound like someone so insecure about his appearance that he's willing to initiate a fight with teenagers over it.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's something that I didn't think about, but that definitely makes a lot of sense.
At this point in the confrontation, remember Navroze's friend William is on the ground and can't see the details of the conflict? But at some point, somebody supposedly throws a can of Coke at Navroze's head, then suddenly the teenagers are beating him up. And they are not just using their fists and feet, they are hitting him with bricks over and over again.
Oh my God, where do they get the bricks? That's crazy.
That's what I thought too, Asad. We don't have that information, but it's crazy and painful just to imagine.
Yeah, sure.
The assault is undoubtedly harsh, but it ends quickly. By the time William gets up from the ground, his friend is lying on the pavement. Don't you find it strange that William was not able to get up from the ground for so long? Or maybe I can't fathom the time lapse in all of this.
Yeah, I mean, again, I've never been in a fight like this of some sort, but when we see things in the movies or on TV, if people get knocked out, they could be on the ground for quite a while. It doesn't seem inconceivable to me, but yeah, I think you're right. I don't know what the time lapse is between all this happening. It seems to be happening very quickly.
Yeah, and I don't want to speculate, but maybe William was also scared. right?
That's a great point too. Yeah.
Anyways, Navroze is unconscious, his nose is bleeding, and as for the teenagers, I imagine they run off. William, who is white, is unharmed. For 4 days, Navroze is in a coma in the hospital, and that doesn't stop his family and friends from coming to see him anyway. But after those 4 days, he dies.
Just a sad story, Saadia. I think like stories that we've covered before, and as I just mentioned, things escalate just so quickly to the point where someone is getting beat up and then dies. And again, I've never been in these scenarios, but it seems like it goes from 0 to 100 so quickly. And the fact that there are bricks involved, like at what point do you grab a weapon and decide that you want to use that? Throwing a Coke bottle at someone's head. These are all things that are just so foreign to me, and yet obviously so common in what we see in violence across the States. It's just so sad and scary. How do you go from teasing someone about their bald head, which people do to me all the time, to beating him into a coma with bricks? It just doesn't make any sense, Adia.
I agree with you, Asad. This situation happens unprompted, escalates suddenly, and then ends quickly. But that's the reason people think those teenagers were motivated by Navroze's race. And you're right, Asad. You don't just beat someone up like that over their lack of hair. And the area does have a history of targeted attacks. We talked about this in the beginning.
Yeah.
Now, if you remember, this area of New Jersey has become increasingly hostile to people coming from India. Why? Well, honestly, the situation looks similar to the experience of various immigrant communities throughout the history.
1 year after the Atlanta spa shooting, Asian Americans still feel under attack.
Colored skin.
Tired, so tired of living in.
Go back to your country, man. You suck.
Well, I say immigrants. I'm actually using the wrong word. They're actually conquerors, and that's the thing.
It's a pretty common formula, unfortunately, right? Large waves of immigrants make this country panic, and New Jersey was no exception. By the 1980s, Jersey City was full of various waves of immigrants, including a pretty tight-knit Indian community of around 15,000 people.
So, Saadia, I feel like we could do a whole other entire series just on hate crimes that happen when immigrant communities start forming in a city, because I feel like we see these stories time and time again, and it's just so sad.
Absolutely. Now, the growth of this community, as we mentioned, also seemed to correlate with the rise in violence and anger directed at said Indian community. Apparently, there were reports at the time of victims being yelled at for buying all the houses, dressing differently, being quote-unquote dirty, and taking over the country.
Wow.
I said it's the same playbook, right?
Same playbook. Yeah, you're exactly right.
Time and again, we hear these nonsensical arguments about taking over the country and being othered. And it really pains me to see that it was happening in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, and it's still happening.
It's still happening, and we're not learning from history, and there's still this idea that, people are different and we can't accept difference. Saadia, it did make me think about a comment that you had mentioned recently, and that was, which gives me hope, and that was how your daughter, when she was in high school, is so open. All the students are open about different sexuality, different cultures, and all that kind of stuff, and it really, really made me more hopeful than some of the stories that we read on here sometimes.
You're absolutely right. I feel with my daughters, I see that differences are celebrated, they are normalized, and I hope this new generation, Gen Z, can flip the script, Asad. But I'm also skeptical because with youth comes idealism, right? So I wonder if they'll be able to sustain it into their later years.
Yeah, let's hope so.
Yeah. Anyways, as you and I know this very well, we hear all the time about this fear that immigrants are taking over the country, and I don't know what the fuck it really means.
Yeah.
But anyway, especially when those immigrants are not from Europe. And I said, to be honest, it always strikes me as so incredibly hypocritical here in America, where every single white person once had European immigrants in their family.
I'm white. What does that mean? Exactly. What does white mean? What does white American.
Yeah.
But there's another element that we need to discuss more in depth here.
Yeah, I think that you're referring to this thing called Dotbusters, which I think you mentioned at the beginning. I was wondering what that was, and I would love to learn a little bit more.
Yes, Asad, you're absolutely right. We are getting into the Dotbusters now. Listeners, I mentioned earlier that only 2 months before Navroze's death, a group called the Dotbusters published a hateful anti-Hindu and anti-Indian letter in the Jersey Journal newspaper. An excerpt of it reads, and I quote, "We will go to any extreme to get Indians to move out of Jersey City. If I'm walking down the street and I see a Hindu and the setting is right, I will hit him or her. They are a weak race, physically and mentally." End quote.
Oh my Lord. And that was a published letter in a newspaper. Wow.
Yes.
Even just the process of someone not only thinking that, but then writing it down, and then at that time mailing the letter to a newspaper, and then the newspaper actually printing it. Like, it just is mind-boggling, the entire process. I just can't even believe it. And yet, of course, I can believe it.
But I said, who were these so-called Dotbusters anyway, right? So we'll get into it now. As you can probably guess, this was a hate group in the Jersey City, Hoboken area. Some sources claim the group was founded in 1975, but the Dotbusters letter in 1987 claimed they had only been around for 2 years. So I am no expert on the hierarchy of hate groups, guys, but maybe this specific branch had only been active for 2 years. Anyways, it was a pretty loosely knit group. One 1988 article from the New York Times even states that the group started as a joke until some of the members started getting violent. It was difficult to identify membership or recognize who exactly was in the group, but apparently most of the members were relatively young and many were high school dropouts and drug addicts.
Yeah, there's no doubt, and I feel like the Proud Boys had a similar kind of beginning where it was an informal group, and then a bunch of people kind of came in and made it more extreme. And then in my head, I would also go to the NRA, which was founded as a hunting organization, and then over the years has developed into this kind of really extremist group, in my opinion. And so whether it was formed as a joke or not, the fact that it progressed into something a lot more than that is hugely problematic.
Exactly, Asad, and I do agree. NRA is an extremist group, just an FYI.
Yeah.
And as we've said, this group targeted the local Indian community. In fact, the name of this hate group came from the circular red mark that South Asian women of various religions often wear on their foreheads. It's most often associated with Hinduism, which is the group that Dotbusters primarily targeted. But notice that I said various religions. Not every person who wears a bindi or dot is Hindu. Not as every person from India practice Hinduism. It's a small detail, but I want to point out to how the group clearly didn't even know the nuances of the people they were so-called busting.
Yeah. Sadly, what makes me think is imagine a hate group that was called Crossbusters, and it was targeting anybody that was wearing a cross, right? It's so unfathomable
Yeah.
and so ridiculous, right? And so, I think I'd encourage our listeners to think about like the Dotbusters in that same way.
Exactly. Thank you for pointing that out, Asa. That's such an important point.
So Saadia, was the Modi family, were they, you said they were Indian, but were they actually Hindu?
Well, Asad, no. One important detail that I haven't mentioned yet is that Navroze Mody and his family were Indian, but they were not Hindu. They actually practiced Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism was based in what is now Iran, but a small number of people in India also practice it. So basically, Zoroastrianism is an ancient religion that originated in Persia, modern day Iran, around 3,500 years ago. It contains both monotheistic and dualistic elements, and many scholars believe that Zoroastrianism influenced the belief systems of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And as I said, today Zoroastrianism is practiced by a small number of people, mainly in India and Iran, and is recognized as one of the world's oldest continuously practiced religions. Now, going back to the Dotbusters, they, in their own words, say they target both Indians and Hindus as if they're always the same thing. So, for a guy like Navroze, who may appear visibly Indian, he could just be clumped in as both Indian and Hindu, and therefore a Dotbuster target.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen this playbook again and again, right? After 9/11, anybody that quote unquote looked like a Muslim was targeted. This is something that unfortunately happens. And, what's crazy to me is that, what you're saying is that it wouldn't have mattered to the Dotbusters what the actual religion of the person was, right?
Absolutely, Asad. And I do want to extend this conversation a bit. Now, as I said, they referred to Hindus specifically in their letter, but it seems like Indians in general are the targets. If you read the entire letter, this gang even talks about looking up the name Patel in the phone book just to harass the family.
Jesus.
Honestly, it kind of reminds me of how some people call all Muslims Arabs, all Arabs Muslims, and it's not accurate. And that ignorance leads to a monolithic, one dimensional perception.
Yeah, sadly, I totally agree with you. And again, it's so frustrating and sad. Sadly, the teenagers that attacked Navroze, were they actually a part of this Dotbusters group? That's the kind of part I'm stuck on.
Yeah, good point, Asad. If we knew for sure that the assailants were Dotbusters, then this case would definitely be a hate crime. But unfortunately, sources don't actually know if those teenagers were Dotbusters. But that is why some context about the Jersey City Hoboken area is so important here. The area had a growing problem with anti-Indian sentiment. This gang was going around harassing people, and 2 months before Navroze dies, the same gang writes and publishes that hateful letter that I read an excerpt from. Jersey City and Hoboken are only 15 minutes away from each other. Jersey City is where Navroze lived, and Hoboken is where he was the night he was beaten. And the Dotbusters were active in those areas during this time. All that, plus the fact that the attack on Navroze was so brutal because of his bald head. Not really, Asad. I don't see that being the only reason for such brutality, right?
Yeah, I mean, I've known a lot of people who have alopecia in my life, and I don't know anybody that's been beaten up because of just that.
Exactly, and that's why sources tend to connect the incident to the Dotbuster group. But I have some more evidence that makes this look like a targeted attack.
Oh,
At least to me, Asad, and you can tell me what your thoughts are.
Sure, yeah.
So, in order to explain, we have to talk about who the attackers were. At least 10 teenagers approached Navroze, but only 4 were arrested and held responsible for the physical assault itself. Their names were Ralph Gonzalez, Luis Padilla, William Acevedo, and Luis Acevedo. They were all around 15 to 17 years old, and the last two, the Acevedos, are actually brothers. Now listen closely, Asad. Earlier in the episode, I mentioned that about 2 weeks before Navroze was attacked, there was another violent incident against Indian men, right? So two students were walking to a restaurant when a group of young men assaulted them with fists, a baseball hat, and a metal bar.
Oh my goodness.
It was pretty serious, but luckily an employee at a chicken restaurant nearby intercepted. His name was Ivan Salas, and he called the police and told the assailants to stop. The assailants then attacked and robbed Salas, but thankfully everyone made it out alive, including those two students. Now, Asad, you must be thinking, why am I bringing this up again? Well, the two students didn't know their attackers and were not able to identify them. But guess what? Ivan Salas did know two of the men in that group, their names, William and Luis Acevedo. The same brothers who would attack and kill Navroze Mody 2 weeks later.
Wow. So, yeah, what you're saying is that these two brothers were part of two really violent attacks against people that were Indian within a 2-week span of each other. Just, yeah, it doesn't seem like a coincidence to me.
Exactly, Asad. And according to a public access law resource website we found, one of the police officers on the case learned something pretty suspicious 3 days after these students were attacked. Apparently, William Acevedo had been telling his friends at school about how he would, quote, beat up two Indians and the chicken man, unquote. The chicken man was Salas. And this goes back to Asad, the idea of hate crime being based on perceived identity of the victim. So they knew exactly that Navroze was, in their minds, a Hindu, which he wasn't, but definitely an Indian.
Yeah, and it's interesting you said that the quote was that he was going to beat them up, not rob them. And so, yeah, there doesn't seem to be another motive. Salas was robbed, but the Indian students in Navroze weren't, right?
No, not according to what we found. I don't think there was another motive.
Yeah, sadly, I feel like that matters because then no one can claim that this was just a robbery and not a potential hate crime.
Yeah, actually, it does become important later, Asad. So I'll share more details on it soon, but just know for now that Acevedos were not arrested.
Oh.
Police would later claim that the two Indian students didn't want to press charges, supposedly, which to me could be because they were scared. Like, what the hell?
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about this before, and I mean, part of the reason why we do this podcast is because so many victims of hate crimes or potential hate crimes don't come forward because they're scared. And so, yeah, you can totally see that with these two Indian students.
Exactly. So we still have to cover the trials that follow, but I wanted to hear from you, Asad. What do you think so far?
Yeah, Saadia, I think this last part was really interesting to me that the brothers had targeted two Indians before. And so, yeah, it seems to me like, similar to some of the stories that we've covered before, like the one in Maine, they were looking to beat someone up. And, they were looking specifically to beat up someone that was Indian in their mind. And so that's how I feel about it, is that it does, for me, feel like a targeted attack.
Mm.
And, Sally, I think that one of the other things that we talk about a lot is that, these kids were really young and, maybe the effect of the area's hostilities, just on young minds, we got to take that into account as well. Like, did they intend to beat him up? Did they intend to kill him? Did they intend to beat him up so severely when they first saw him? Was it a targeted event? Like these are all kind of the questions that I'm thinking about in my head.
Absolutely, Asad. And I think we've spoken about this previously, but when perpetrators are this young, do we call it accidental hate crime? And this is the term that you coined, which really resonated with me because their brains are not fully developed. How do we punish them? What should that punishment look like? There's so many questions that we have yet to plow through, and I really want our listeners to pay close attention, and we would love to hear your thoughts. Our listeners, what do you think? A 15-year-old or a 16-year-old, if they committed hate crime, how would you approach that? How would you see them? What are your thoughts on that? Going back to the case, as it turns out, the courts did not see this as a hate crime. Police and the attorneys involved stated that the teenagers didn't make a reference to Modi's race or nationality while they attacked him. Now, this to me is problematic, Asad, irrespective of their age. It's about the intent, right? So they may not necessarily say something verbally or articulate it, but if the motivation indicates that it was a hate crime, and if they are bragging about it later, then it should be considered a hate crime and classified as such.
Yeah, as you were reading this and as you were saying this, that's exactly where my mind went, is like essentially what law enforcement is saying, or prosecutors are saying, that if you want to commit a hate crime and not be charged as a hate crime, just don't say anything while you're beating someone up or trying to kill them. Like that is my takeaway on this. Like it seems like such a ridiculous thing that you have to be actively verbally saying something that's racist or whatever it may be to be considered hate crime, and that just seems ridiculous to me.
Absolutely, Asad. And something else that I was thinking about was, how did the police know this, right? How did they know that the teenagers did not make any references to Modi's race or nationality? But I assume that they spoke to William Crawford, Navroze's friend, and I guess William didn't hear anything racially or ethnically derogatory, which makes it hard to prove any race or culture based motivations, at least in the eyes of the law enforcement. But it also makes me think, if he was lying on the pavement, maybe half unconscious, he probably wasn't paying attention to what they were saying, right? So to me, this is so crazy and bizarre, and it goes back to maybe the law enforcement in this country is not equipped to handle and prosecute hate crimes.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, Saadia.
But you know what else is frustrating is the number of opposing opinions about the situation. Now, one prosecutor, for example, a man named Paul de Pascal, said that the attack was not ethnically or racially motivated. But then an archived New York Times article from 1988 quotes de Pascal on a different occasion where he said, and I quote, "I think you can make the assumption that these two didn't like Asian Indians," end quote. Now, these two refers to the Acevedo brothers, and in a separate response to the increased number of attacks against Indians overall, a member of New Jersey's Assembly Judiciary Committee spoke out too. His name was Joseph Charles Jr., and he said that yes, there are ethnic motivations behind these Jersey City Hoboken attacks. So we are getting these mixed signals, Asad. Some people are saying it was racially motivated or religiously motivated. Others are saying it wasn't. There's so much confusing, contradictory information out there. It's almost impossible to sift through and really believe in one source over the other.
Yeah. And just to clarify, Navroze's attack is not also considered to be ethnically motivated, right?
No, again, that comes back to the lack of actual racial slurs during the incident, which is so stupid. It's honestly frustrating because it looks like multiple sources generally believe that these teenagers had some bias against Navroze, but there's technically no concrete evidence, and evidence being racial slurs.
Yeah, so they weren't charged with a hate crime, they were just charged with murder, right?
Nope. That's another frustrating part of this case, Asad.
Oh no.
Even though the 4 teenagers were initially charged with murder, the convictions were dropped to assault. Ralph Gonzalez, Luis Padilla, and Luis Acevedo were convicted of aggravated assault, and William Acevedo was convicted of simple assault. Their exact sentencing is unclear, but they didn't spend too long in jail, certainly not the length of a murder conviction. Luis Acevedo, for example, served 4 years in jail, and some sources say that William Acevedo's simple assault conviction had a maximum of 6 months. Asad, I'm torn because on the one hand, they killed someone and they should be punished for that. But also, I've been noticing a trend across quite a few of these stories we've covered so far, and I want to contend with it for a moment, right? So, in this case and others, the perpetrators are young men. Beyond that, they are often from lower income groups. We don't know if these assailants specifically were Dotbusters, but we do know that Dotbusters were often young dropouts and therefore more likely to struggle socioeconomically. And it's made me think about the role of class and masculinity in these cases, right? So, for instance, some sources tie the rise in anti Indian sentiment in New Jersey to a perceived wealth gap between Indian immigrants and the native residents of the area. Now, Asad, I'm definitely not trying to be an apologist for hateful speech and behavior, but I do think it could be an important conversation that maybe you and I at some point should have on this podcast, and we should bring some expert guests to talk about it, right? Because to me, it seems like these people were frustrated with their economic position. For instance, and I'll share this with you and the listeners, Asad, I found a research article from 1996 about Navroze's murder and the anti-Indian sentiment in the area. In an interview, one Jersey City resident said, and I quote, "We are just jealous because they," referring to Indians, "have more money than we do," unquote.
Wow. Indians as the scapegoat for class conflict, just crazy. I think that we've seen this time and time again where whole groups of people are blamed for, a bigger sentiment or action. And so who's really responsible for lower wages or the lack of jobs in an area? Is it really that Indian Americans or Indians are coming in to take these jobs? It's just ridiculous for to me that you can target an entire class of people for something like that, and then regardless of frustrations, like it's just not excusable to just go around taunting and hurting people because you are upset with your current economic state.
Well, going back to the case, we couldn't find too much information on the assailants post jail time, but we were able to dig up the whereabouts of one in particular. It's one of the Acevedo brothers, Luis. We found an article from 2011 featuring Luis, who would have been 39 years old by then. He's expressed pain and regret for assaulting and eventually killing Navroze. And in 2006, he founded the Save the Youth Academy and an after-school program for kids to get into creative arts and get away from crime, drugs, and gangs. Asad, it looks like he wants to stop kids from going down the same route he did, which I honestly appreciate. Now, Luis has 2 sons of his own, and luckily it looks like the hateful behavior of his youth hasn't passed down.
Yeah, Saadia, in this sense, then it makes me feel like the justice system got it right, and that if this was the outcome for Luis, he's obviously been changed and doing something really productive for society after killing Navroze.
Exactly, Asad. So we are almost done. There's just one final thing to address. Navroze's parents were obviously dissatisfied with how their son's case played out. The perpetrators received short sentences and it was not ruled as a hate crime. So in 1992, 5 years after his son's death, Navroze Mody ended up trying to sue the city of Hoboken and a few of its police officers. He claimed that the Jersey City police had been indifferent and unresponsive to previous acts of violence targeting Indians and were therefore partially responsible for Navroze's death. Jamshed even claimed that the police infringed upon Navroze's constitutional equal protection rights. There's a lot of information in the write-up of this case, and we don't have time to cover here, but it's a public resource if you are interested and want to learn more online. So we'll share links to the story. But basically, remember the 2 Indian students who were attacked in early September? The Acevedo brothers were 2 assailants in that case as well, but Again, nobody was arrested. Apparently, the police never asked those students if they wanted to file a complaint or press charges, so the students assumed that the police would arrest the attackers.
Yeah, Saadia, that would be my assumption too, is that the police would be the ones that are following up on an attack. So yeah, I'm with the students on this one.
Exactly. And by the way, I said they gave police their phone numbers too, but the police didn't follow up. It ends up being a misunderstanding of the law. I don't know what happened there. But, anyways, the police were probably waiting for the students to file a complaint, and the students were waiting for the police to take action. A lot of people honestly don't know their rights as well as they should, but at the same time, isn't it the police's job to assist the victims here? So that to me is a bit mind-boggling and crazy.
Yeah.
Plus, according to this case report, the police could have legally charged the attackers anyway, regardless of a filed complaint, Asad. And this really drives me crazy. They could have done it and they didn't.
Yeah, totally.
Asad, you and I already know this, that law issues are complicated and a little tough to follow, but I really ask my listeners to stay with me here. Now, Navroze's father, Jamshed, claimed that the police didn't follow up because the victims were Indian.
Wow, okay.
And to be honest, I don't think it's completely unfounded. We've discussed on this podcast before about how often subconscious racial bias sneaks into the justice system.
Totally.
But also an attorney named Peter Van Schaik claims to have spoken to a few Hoboken policemen. One officer apparently tells Van Schaik that the, quote, dot busting problem was not a high priority for the police. So, for Jamshed, the question becomes, if officers had taken anti-Indian attacks seriously, would Navroze still be alive today?
Yeah. You know, Saadia, I mean, there's no doubt that I think that in my head, if they'd taken it more seriously, that the outcome would have been different, because the brothers probably would have been, arrested and hopefully, on their path to being held accountable for that first attack on students. But, to me, I think this is a bigger issue of the flexibility that law enforcement have in pursuing, and prosecutors have in pursuing, different criminal cases and whatnot. And, I think about that quite a bit, especially when it comes to people of color and people of lower economic, status. And there seems to be like, we need to have more understanding of how decisions are made and what things are prioritized and not prioritized from the police, because this kind of stuff to me still is happening, every day in America.
I agree, Asad. But in the end, unfortunately, the courts ruled in favor of the police. They said there was not sufficient evidence to prove that the police department's indifference was connected to discrimination against Indians. So, disappointed once again, Navroze's parents moved back to California. At the very least, there have been various positive changes in response to this incident. There were meetings between the Indian community, the police, and the elected officials, which is great. The Indian community also marched and protested against the indifference to their harassment, and the media was reportedly sympathetic. A group out of Columbia University called Indian Youth Against Racism also started documenting anti-Indian violence in New Jersey and implementing cultural programs in schools. Eventually, they helped pass a New Jersey bill raising mandatory penalties for bias crimes. Legal protections against violence motivated by racial, religious, and ethnic discrimination were important, right? Because most existing New Jersey laws only protected against the threats or property damage. And to be honest, Asad, it's not a perfect situation, as anti-Indian attacks didn't immediately end, but it was a start. And a 2016 report said that these attacks have decreased dramatically in recent years, which is great. I mean, I can only hope that people like the Mody family no longer feel scared living in the Jersey City areas. That's my hope, Asad.
Yeah, no doubt. This case wasn't officially ruled a hate crime, but that doesn't mean that the racist rhetoric and behavior that surrounded his neighborhood didn't matter.
Exactly, Asad. So what do you think? Would you classify it as a hate crime?
Yeah, for me, as you were reading the story, my initial feelings were that it wasn't a hate crime. It was that it was a violent, attack or beating, and but then when you talked about the history of the attackers and that they had just attacked the two students, just weeks before, for me that was what I needed to kind of get over the hump of that. Yes, this should have been considered a hate crime because he was targeted as an Indian. And so, yeah, for me, I think that this was a hate crime and should have been prosecuted as a hate crime. How about you, Saadia?
I also think, I said, this was a hate crime. And to me, this whole idea of somebody explicitly using certain racial slurs for it to be classified as a hate crime is just bizarre. And given their previous history, given what they did to Navroze, and post his death and this incident, how these kids were bragging about how they wanted to hurt Indians, shows that this was absolutely a hate crime, especially because they had a perceived identity idea about who Navroze was, and they targeted him specifically for that. So I am with you on this, and I would really like to know what our listeners think. Every week at the end of each episode, we deliberate and we decide whether we think it's a hate crime or not. But I'm really curious to know what our listeners listening to this right now are thinking. So write to us if you have thoughts on any case, this or other cases, and tell us how you would deliberate this case and how you will approach it.
Yeah, thanks again for listening. You can also reach us on Instagram and Twitter. Just search for the Invisible Hate Podcast. If you do like what you hear, we really ask that you share this with a friend. That's how we can grow our listenership and create more impact about these issues. Invisible Hate is a joint production of Rafaelion Media and Immigrantly. We'd like to thank our team, which includes Michaela Strather, Isabel Havens, Lindsay Gamble, and Paroma Chakravarti. Our music was done by Simon Hutchinson. We'll be back next week with another hate crime for us to analyze. Until then, I'm Asad Butt.
And I'm Saadia Khan.